I was watching football, and Mando is all over football. You got your spray deodorant, aluminum-free and ideal for hard-to-reach places, like your bum, and clinically proven to control odor better than a shower with soap alone. Mando's starter pack is perfect for new customers. It comes with a solid stick deodorant, cream tube deodorant, 2 free products of your choice like a mini body wash and deodorant wipes, and free shipping. As a special offer for listeners, new customers get $5 off the starter pack with our exclusive code. That equates to over 40% off your starter pack use. Code is Shane, S-H-A-N-E, at shopmando, shopmando.com. Please support our new show. Tell them we sent you. Smell fresher, stay drier, and boost your confidence from head to toe with Mando.
This week, I will reinstate any service members who were unjustly expelled from our military for objecting to the COVID vaccine mandate.
As President Trump's second term begins, the story around COVID is clearly far from over.
President Trump also delivered on a campaign promise to withdraw the United States from the World Health Organization. The White House accuses the WHO of mishandling the COVID-19 pandemic.
And a lot of the information the administration will be reviewing is coming from a bombshell 2-year investigation by a House Select Committee.
Trust has to be earned, and we have to get it back. But you can't silence scientific debate.
Here's another email to Mark Zuckerberg. It says, subject line, COVID misinformation, Wuhan lab leak theory. In response to continued public pressure and tense conversations with the new administration, we started removing 5 COVID claims, including the lab leak theory.
We now know that Mark Zuckerberg and Meta were pressured by the U.S. government to do a lot of these things.
I think there's a general lack of trust, independent of a lack of trust for public health agencies like CDC, FDA.
There have been credible death threats, and credible death threats mean someone who clearly was on their way to kill me.
I think people were trying to get it right. They just didn't get it right at times. And I do think that looking back, we oversold this vaccine because we were so desperate to have people get it.
All that we ask is show us the data. Just open the books.
I think what I'm most concerned about as we go forward as a country and from our agencies is that we can be trusted and that we are better in our messaging and talk about clarity.
Congressman Brad Wenstrup oversaw the House committee that conducted a 2-year investigation into COVID-19 vaccines.
We have to take a good hard look at what we did, what we didn't do, be honest with ourselves, be better in our messaging to the American people, especially when it comes to health.
Okay, so we got into Origin, which is, by the way, a political mire unto itself. But let's get into what affected people's lives. There's a lot of information that came out that was not true, or there were cover-ups, which is, by the way, detrimental to all of us, but the health process going forward. And we'll get into that at the end. About you mentioning, look, we have to solve these problems. Otherwise, let's say it's Ebola next time, and there's a lot more deaths, and people aren't going to get vaccinated because we messed this one up so badly. Mm-hmm. But let's get into it. What were some of the worst things? For example, health fallouts from the vaccine itself, the social distancing, closing downs of schools, $200 billion of fraud. I mean, the list goes on. What were some of the most egregious? And maybe, I'll let you summarize. Let's say, give me your top 3 so we keep it manageable.
Well, you mentioned a lot of them, and they're in the report, right? But let me just start with this premise. And I said this from the beginning, is that America needed to hear from the doctors treating COVID patients, not the politicians and not the person in the lab. If you had a doctor locally, nationally, walking out of the hospital, lowering their mask and saying, here's what we saw today. But the messaging was wrong. Dr. Fauci at one time said, if you get the vaccine, it's a dead end for the virus. No, it's not, and it never was, and we knew that from the trials. And then we asked Dr. Fauci, was there science behind the masks idea, the mask mandate? And he's like, no.
Yeah.
No, we didn't have any science behind that. How about the 6 feet? Well, that just sort of appeared. Well, we found out that the teachers union had a lot to do with deciding what that distance should be. And we saw in their emails that they weren't talking about how they can get the kids caught up and educate them. They kept talking about a trigger to close. They just wanted to keep the schools closed. Never did they really engage like we're going to have to get the kids caught up and things like that. So you just see all these behaviors going on, and that's why we propose a structure at the end that's going to be much more organized with clarity, and you come together. You don't have one agency saying one thing and another agency saying another, and we try to get it in a proper order.
I'm just going to say there's a quote here that on the summary of the report that says public health officials often spread misinformation through conflicting messaging, knee-jerk reactions, and lack of transparency. In the most egregious examples of pervasive misinformation campaigns, off-label, it goes on. But I'm like, that's incredibly damning, no?
Yes, and so you're never going to establish trust. And look, we had General Fredericks, who's now in the White House, and he's chairing the pandemic preparedness and response team there. And he came to the Doctors Caucus, and one of the questions he asked is, how do we restore trust? And I said, well, I think one of the things we're going to have to do is get it out of the White House and be able to approach the American people with a trust from a trusted source. And you have to put all sides of the equation out there. You have to have scientific arguments. You can't shut down doctors. You can't take doctors out of the equation, which is what the mandate did. All these things create distrust. And if we were honest about the vaccine from the very beginning and very public in saying, this is a new technology, this is not the same as your polio vaccine. And really what this, if you even want to call it a vaccine, this was more of a therapy. The mRNA vaccine that came out bolstered your immune system. And I was very much in favor of emergency use for the vulnerable. And that's where we should have focused too. We created a lot of distrust when we started telling people that you have to have it. And when so many people were getting COVID and recovering.
What we knew from the trials is that, one, it saved a lot of lives. That's one thing. But we also knew that if you got vaccinated, you could still get COVID. We didn't make that clear to the American people in my mind. But if someone stands up and says, if you get vaccinated, you're never going to go to the ICU and you're not going to die. Well, that was still happening.
The Twitter account of leading U.S. virologist Dr. Robert Malone has been banned. In a tweet, Dr. Malone has noted that Pfizer's 6-month data showed that its COVID vaccine caused more illness than it prevents.
Dr. Robert Malone was on the team that helped invent the technology used in COVID vaccines.
Dr. Robert Malone, in the late 1980s, conducted a landmark experiment on the path to the COVID-19 vaccines. And this is Dr. Malone today.
Regarding the genetic COVID vaccines, the science is settled. They're not working.
But quickly became one of the loudest voices raising questions about the vaccine during the pandemic. Dr. Robert Malone, you were part of the team that wrote the original patent for mRNA vaccines. Your specialty became helping government assemble teams to address infectious diseases to the point where you've been at the forefront of five different outbreaks. Went to Harvard, et cetera. You are an expert in the field, and if I got anything wrong, tell me now.
Oh, that's close enough.
Okay.
The agenda is not to recite my accomplishments. It's to clarify the that's gone down over the last 5 years.
Well, there we go. So that's what I want to do. And to begin at the beginning, it's very problematic because there's been lots of different shifts in narrative and rhetoric, and you are in the mix. You're in the center. You're in the eye of the storm. I want to start at the beginning. You've been outspoken about some of the risks associated with mRNA and COVID-19 vaccines, which is interesting because you were part of the team that invented them, literally. What are the specific safety concerns that you think that should have been more thoroughly investigated and or told to the public in the beginning during the COVID response?
So the best documentation about what was known at the beginning, and I think that's an important distinction to differentiate what's known now versus what was known at the outset, because a lot of people lump it all together and they make various statements. Why didn't you say this back then, et cetera? But because many cases it wasn't known. What was known is documented in the Pfizer, what's called the Pfizer Common Technical Document. And a subset of the information that was initially submitted to the FDA was also submitted to the Japanese regulatory authority. And unlike the FDA, they made that publicly available. They put it on a server. And in that document, it provided a summary of what Pfizer knew at the time that this was being prosecuted and emergency use authorized by the FDA. And so this common technical document that was released by the Japanese authority provides us with source documentation about what Pfizer knew at that point in time, and by extension, what the FDA knew. Pfizer knew at the outset, you'll recall that the narrative that was promoted was that the product would be remain in the shoulder in which it was injected and the draining lymph nodes. Mm-hmm. So that was a key part of the narrative, and the accompanying kind of safety logic was that this, once you injected it, it would stay put. It wouldn't go all over your body. But in the original documents, it clearly demonstrated that these products go throughout the body, and that they are distributed to virtually all organs in the body, as opposed to what we were told, and that they had a particular odd predilection for ovarian tissue and bone marrow and spleen and many other sensitive organs in the body. Strangely, that biodistribution is the technical term, was not investigated at the FDA. Furthermore, the FDA basically accepted at face value what Pfizer disclosed without questioning it, which is very unusual behavior for the FDA. We had initial evidence that it goes all over the body, that it goes to particular organs, including reproductive tissues, that it goes to the brain, and that it was likely to cause toxicity in these organs, because that was a known problem going back to when I was working on the tech and then abandoned it in the 1990s because I could not overcome that toxicity. Lipid nanoparticles are intrinsically toxic. So you have a demonstration of widespread distribution of this injected product. And then you also, at the same time, had the emergence of the initial reports from the CDC VAERS system. The reports that were being submitted of adverse events upon the initial round of administrations were that this was associated with a much larger and broader range of harms or adverse events that had been seen in any prior vaccine deployment.
Any prior vaccine for COVID or any prior vaccine, full stop?
Full stop.
12 hours after a shower, the average man's grundle odor, I don't even know what a grundle is. It's like page 72 of Chatterbait, but it's a 5 out of 10. With Mando, the average grundle odor is a 0 out of 10, and the scientists who did that are bonkers. You now find Mando in Walmart, Target, and other retailers across the country. For the best deals, go to shopmando.com. Mando's starter pack is perfect for new customers. It comes with a solid stick, deodorant, cream tube deodorant, 2 free products of your choice like a mini body wash and deodorant wipes, and free shipping. As a special offer for listeners, new customers get $5 off the starter pack with our exclusive code. That equates to over 40% off your starter pack use. Code is Shane, S-H-A-N-E, at shopmando, shopmando.com. Please support our new show. Tell them we sent you. Smell fresher, stay drier, and boost your confidence from head to toe with Mando.
You can see the documentation of these early data as we first encountered them, including the bar graphs of the adverse events, the categories of adverse events, the relative event rate for those adverse events compared to all other prior vaccines. It's explicitly clear that basically on the same scale, the bar graph for prior adverse event reports into the VAERS is at a very low level with prior vaccines, and then it just shoots up 100-fold or more as soon as they start doing the SARS-CoV-2 vaccines.
And what are some of the adverse effects?
The key ones that are well documented now. We had these reports then But now even the CDC acknowledges that the adverse event of myocarditis.
Sorry, myocarditis is inflammation of the heart.
Yeah, which is particularly distributed into youth and in particular young males up to military age, so mid-20s, early 30s, is quite prevalent. Another major adverse event, and that is neurotoxicity. So the neurotoxicity is both in the peripheral nerves and in the brain, the central nervous system. And we knew that that was a risk based on some studies done at the Salk Institute. And that's another one that I spoke about and was fact-checked as false.
Fact-checked by
now been published.
Fact-checked by whom?
So there were multiple early fact-checker organizations that were set loose on me.
Why? Because you were speaking out against the vaccine, or speaking up for the danger? Why were they let loose on you?
So that would be speculation, which I tend to not do. Okay, I can tell you that the observation was that it happened.
Yeah.
Developed, and there's documented evidence of an agreement between the UK government and the US government that any information that would cause, quote, vaccine hesitancy, in other words, cause somebody to think twice about taking the jab, must be suppressed or withheld, should not be able to be shared with the public, whether true or false. And so concurrent with that, there appears to have been a concerted campaign to delegitimize or otherwise suppress any discussion of potential risks, because a discussion of potential risks, whether true or false, would cause vaccine hesitancy. And there was also a practice of kind of a whataboutism. Well, if this is occurring, this particular type of toxicity associated with, say, spike protein.
Yeah.
Because one of my early statements was that spike is a toxin, and that's now accepted to be the case. To kind of disambiguate or disentangle the toxicity story, it's really helpful to remember that we had multiple vaccines.
Yes.
And the rest of the world relied on many different vaccines other than the RNA vaccines. The RNA vaccines were more restricted to the West in particular.
And didn't AstraZeneca have some problems here?
Okay, so let's get into that. AstraZeneca and J&J both deployed another gene therapy strategy for vaccination. That's recombinant adenovirus. Adenovirus is a cold virus. So their products also expressed spike protein. Unlike the RNA vaccines, their technology platform had been used in prior vaccines that had been more widely deployed. So we had information about the adverse event profile of those technologies from prior vaccinations. And then we also have another group of vaccines that involve purified protein. So you could think of those as more like traditional vaccines that also administered spike protein to the subject, but not in a replication competent or a gene therapy-like form. So you can compare adenovectored gene therapy spike protein vaccines to mRNA vectored gene therapy spike protein vaccines to purified protein like Novavax. And by comparing those three, you can say, well, we see this spectrum of adverse events with this platform, this spectrum with that platform, and this spectrum with that platform. So the toxicities that are in common across all three are probably due to spike, and the toxicities that are different are probably due to the platform.
And AstraZeneca, the adverse effects were neurological?
They were actually the ones that killed him. And remember, it's AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson.
Yeah.
AZ was UK and Europe. J&J was US. The thing that killed him was the blood clotting. The blood clotting problem exists in the adenovectored, in the mRNA vectored, and in the purified protein. So we can reliably say that whatever is causing the blood clotting problem is related to spike protein. And there's the biology of that has been advanced considerably. And there's been all kinds of controversy about these highly cross-linked clots. Then there's a more delayed type of cardiotoxicity that has to do with microclots. And those microclots can form anywhere in the body. So the consequence of that is that you can have brain damage, stroke. You can have kidney damage. You can have liver damage. People get a strange red, blotchy damage to their skin and muscles. You can get that kind of clotting, small vessel damage anywhere in your body if it gets triggered.
And this data was suppressed.
All this information was suppressed. You couldn't talk about it. You would get deplatformed. Another one that was really striking, women had tragic stories of what technically you would call dysmenorrhea or menometrorrhagia. So their periods suddenly were profoundly disrupted. Old women that were postmenopausal suddenly started having bleeding. Women were reporting that they no longer were having menstruation, or they were having irregular menstruation, or they were having it all the time. And they had formed interest groups on Facebook. Mm-hmm. And they grew quite large. And Facebook deplatformed them. So these women that were experiencing these syndromes were being told by their physicians that it was all in their head, that they were just being hysterical. Remember, the root word of hysterical is hyster, which is the uterus. This is like old school medicine. This is what physicians back in the day might say if a woman was being emotional, for instance, is they were being hysterical. Well, this couldn't possibly have anything to do with the vaccine. Mm-hmm. Then the CDC came out with statements with no data supporting them that this product was safe in pregnancy. It's always been, particularly the RNA vaccines, it's always been the case, it's the norm with vaccines and new products that you never deploy them into pregnant women. That's always a late stage trial, and it requires rigorous examination because of the susceptibility of the fetus to all kinds of different effects. But we knew from the original Pfizer data package that I referred to you to that this stuff goes to the ovary, which controls menstruation, and it goes to the uterus, and it causes blood clots, which are a major issue if you have a uterus. So these women were experiencing these symptoms very early on, and they were being silenced in every way possible. If you spoke about these things on social media, you were immediately deplatformed.
But with what reason? What was the logic behind it?
No reason ever given. So once again, I can only infer. Lots of people were saying all kinds of stuff that were speculative. And I held back all the way through and would only talk about things for which there was a clear document trail. We now know that Mark Zuckerberg and Meta were pressured by the US government to do a lot of these things, from the disclosures from the House Judiciary Committee and the Committee on Weaponization of Government, and the Twitter files and the Facebook files and these other sets of documents. Now we can reconstruct a lot of that history, and it all indicates that there was pressure from both WHO and from the US government to silence any voices that were raising any concerns about vaccine safety, all based on the logic that the vaccine was safe and effective and that the virus was highly lethal. Both of those were falsehoods.
Do you believe that the death rates were inflated?
Absolutely. There's no question about it. The case fatality rate for this virus, once the dust settled, as documented by Jay Bhattacharya very early on, is a fraction of 1%. Yet we were all told that it was between 3.5 and 3.8%.
And why would they inflate the death numbers?
What is documented is that the government, promoted by the CDC in particular, resulted in financial benefits to physicians and hospitals for every diagnosed case of SARS-CoV-2. And so the practice, whether or not it was the government's intent, the functional practice that developed was that if you had any person come into the hospital And imagine the hypothetical gunshot wound to the head. The gunshot wound to the head comes to the hospital. We're downtown Chicago, and they stick a nose swab up that poor soul's nose and run a PCR at a high cycle number, come back with a positive result. Then the hospital would be able to declare that the death, any pathologist would say, was due to the gunshot wound, was due to SARS-CoV-2 because they had evidence of a PCR positivity. And why would they do that? Because then they get a bonus. There was a structural financial incentive in the compensation programs, and it may be the government did this with the best of intent. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt. So what the government policy was early on, this is under Trump, was that hospitals would stop providing elective procedures. And imagine you're the owner of a large hospital consortium, and the government has just told you that the only thing that keeps your hospital profitable, you're no longer allowed to do, because the Medicare and all that stuff, you lose money on. You make money on elective procedures, surgical and otherwise. And now the government, Mr. Government, is telling you, no, you can't do that anymore, because there's going to be so many cases, they're going to overwhelm the hospitals. And so you got to stop doing any elective procedures. So you go back and you say, well, what are you going to do to compensate me? Because you're basically stealing my revenue and my property through your policies. So Mr. Government says, well, we're going to compensate you because we're going to give you an extra bonus for each of these cases that you take care of. It may be as simple as that. And all of this nefarious conspiracy speculation that the government intentionally inflated the numbers may just boil down to some bureaucrat making a decision about compensation policy for hospitals because they're telling them all that they're not going to do elective procedures. I speculate. That's the best possible explanation I can come up with. But the functional consequence was that the numbers of death were highly inflated. And then those numbers of death were used to justify a whole series of government policies. They basically validated what I assert to be groupthink that was happening in the small in-club cohort of people that were advising Trump and making the decisions.
And I want to get into that, but just because you bring up Trump, what do you think Trump got right and what do you think he got wrong? And also, what do you think Biden got right and what do you think Biden got wrong?
Early on, Trump was with Peter Navarro and others, was much more focused on repurposed drugs. When he was infected, remember he got infected.
Yeah.
He got a bad case of COVID. He was obese. He had a lot of the risk factors and he got sick. And he was treated with a classic early treatment, as has been advocated by many. He got right the promotion of early treatment, the advocacy of repurposed medicines. It was appropriate to advance the development of a vaccine product. Inappropriate to do so under Operation Warp Speed.
I hope we're going to have a vaccine, and we're going to fast track it like you've never seen before.
Operation Warp Speed, a multi-billion-dollar research and manufacturing effort to shorten the typical year-plus vaccine development timeline.
Rapidly accelerate the vaccine by dropping a lot of the key testing requirements and shortening up the clinical trials. And also, there was a branch of Operation Warp Speed that focused on monoclonal antibodies and new drugs. So that's what gives us remdesivir and the other pharmaceutical agents.
So that's Trump. What about Biden?
The mandates were grossly unethical. The messaging about basically dark winter.
We're still facing a very dark winter. There are now nearly 10 million COVID cases in the United States. Last week, we topped 120,000 new cases on multiple successive days.
That if you don't take this vaccine, you're going to die, that you're putting everybody else at risk.
There is no time to waste. The Delta variant is dangerous and spreading. causing a pandemic of the unvaccinated. That's the pandemic of the unvaccinated.
A lot of that propaganda started under Trump, but it was really accelerated during Biden. The mandates for federal employees.
American troops face a controversial vaccine mandate. If they refuse the shot, they could be dishonorably discharged.
It might have been acceptable and good policy in a limited way to do lockdowns or quarantines in areas that are hotbeds for spread. But the lockdown, economic, sociologic, what's called non-pharmaceutical interventions, mask use, for example, none of that in retrospect has been proven to have been useful. These were not the established policies prior to SARS-CoV-2 at the WHO or at the national level.
I would like to get to your personal, what happened to you personally. But I just wanted to get the science down first, because you were a scientist who's deeply involved. I'm just going to summarize. You're deeply involved in the development of the technology of mRNA uptake vaccines, as well as a lot of other vaccines. You put up your hand and say, hey, hold on, there's some problems here. You get deplatformed. You get sort of pushed to the side.
I get cyberbullied.
You get cyberbullied.
I get gang stalked. I get character assassinated in the Atlantic Monthly, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Business Insider, Rolling Stone, Mother Jones, all in a concerted wave.
And so now that information is coming out about the health effects and the suppressed information, A, do you feel vindicated? And B, you know, what do you think the political fallout is? Because now you have people who are going to be very reluctant to either listen to the government, follow protocols, follow mandates. Now that there's this historical precedent of suppressing information, what's the fallout for that?
This is something I've been saying for 3 years at least, is the logical consequence of the policies that were implemented, the propaganda, censorship, etc., is that it will result in the destruction of public support for the vaccine enterprise in general. Remember, this used to be my career.
Sure.
It'll result in broad-based public skepticism about clinical research. It used to be that about 5 to 10% of the population at a stretch could be considered, quote, anti-vaxxers.
Yeah.
Now, there's been a little bit of a sea change because Webster's redefined the nature of the word, the meaning of the word anti-vaxxer, to include people who are against vaccine mandates. That didn't used to be the case. But now over 50% of the general population self-identifies as being an anti-vaxxer. Vaccine hesitancy and questioning on the part of parents concerning the childhood vaccine schedule is broad-based. The skepticism about the CDC, the NIH, FDA. I'll give you an anecdote. An old woman who had lost her husband, she asked a question, and what she said was, we used to believe that the FDA was the gold standard for the world for regulatory authority, integrity, honesty.
Yeah.
And now we can see that they're corrupt. And for me, that literally hit me like a brick to the head. I had never had that thought before then, where I realized that this thing that I committed my life to, becoming an expert in regulatory affairs, learning all this about the vaccine industry and the practices and the proper way to do things, that I had been misled, that I had given my career to an agency and a process that was corrupt.
It is important to vaccinate children. I mean, although they don't commonly suffer this virus, they can suffer it. We had more than 170 children die last year of COVID-19.
Now, on the opposite side of the argument from Dr. Malone is Dr. Paul Offit, who worked closely with the FDA and CDC during the pandemic and is an outspoken supporter of the COVID vaccine. Dr. Paul Offit, director of the Vaccine Education Center at the Children's Hospital in Philadelphia, member of the FDA's Vaccine Advisory Committee, co-inventor of the rotavirus vaccine, and you wrote a book called Tell Me When It's Over. which I want somebody to tell me when this is over, but I don't think it's going to be over anytime soon. It's getting more and more controversial. We're here to chop it up. Dr. Paul Offit, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for asking me.
So you're an expert on vaccines, and in fact, you're a member of the FDA's Vaccine Advisory Committee. I think what people forget, and I'm going to steal your quote, is that we're building the plane while it was flying.
For sure.
Maybe you could put a bit of meat on the bone about, what you saw in your capacity, while this was all happening.
Well, you learn as you go. I mean, I think that probably most striking was when we, the FDA Vaccine Advisory Committee, sat down in December of 2020 to review those two vaccines, those two messenger RNA or mRNA vaccines made by Pfizer and Moderna.
Yeah.
Data that were presented to us showed those two vaccines were 95% effective at all manner of symptomatic illness, mild, moderate, and severe. Now, 6 months later, studies showed that protection against mild and moderate illness had gone from 95% to 50%. So the question then becomes, well, why was it 95% in December of 2020? And the answer is those were 3-month studies. Those participants had just gotten their second dose, so they still had a big boost in their antibody response, which then faded over 6 months. They were still protected against severe disease, but not against mild or moderate disease. And I don't think we made that clear from the beginning, that this was a vaccine that was designed to keep you out of the hospital, keep you out of the intensive care unit, keep you from dying. It was not a vaccine designed to protect against all manner of symptomatic illness for very long.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, and I believe President Biden said this is a pandemic of the unvaccinated.
Here's the latest data that confirms that we're still in a pandemic of the unvaccinated.
There was this feeling that, if I'm vaccinated, I'm not going to get it, and then you would get it. And so that was the first sort of, let's say, the crack in the wall, or the kink in the armor, maybe.
Yeah, and then the term that was used for people who had an asymptomatic infection or a mild infection following vaccination was breakthrough infections, and that was not the right term. The word breakthrough implies failure. This wasn't a failure. This was a success. If you'd gotten the vaccine and then you had a mild or asymptomatic infection, you should celebrate that, because that's as good as that vaccine can do. But we didn't. We sort of stigmatized it as being something that the public saw as a failure. Also, we were trying to decrease transmission, and the vaccine did decrease transmission, but it didn't eliminate it. And I think that was the other thing that people didn't understand.
Yeah, the other thing was, I guess, sort of the mandated part of it, that, you were sort of forced into taking the vaccines to be able to work and or travel and, sort of get around and do things, school, So what do you think about the fact that the government effectively mandated this vaccine?
Right. I think at the time, it certainly made sense. I mean, if you were working in the hospital at that time, 2020, 2021, 2022, you were 12 times more likely to be hospitalized and die in 2021, and 6 times more likely to be hospitalized and die in 2022 if you were unvaccinated. And our hospitals were overwhelmed. People were working double shifts. We canceled elective surgeries. And it was a little galling, frankly, when people would choose not to get a vaccine when they could have gotten it, and that still came into the hospital and perfectly willing to burden the hospital with their disease when they could have helped us out by getting a vaccine to prevent at least serious infection. So I can understand it. In a better world, you shouldn't need to have vaccines mandated. I mean, in a better world, you're informed about the vaccine and you look at all the data and you realize it's safe and effective and you get it. But we don't live in that world. And so I think in retrospect, though, this was seen as too heavy-handed. Not only were vaccines mandated, but you had your little vaccines card and couldn't go necessarily to your favorite bar or restaurant or sporting event,
other country,
worship, or travel, right? So we shuttered schools, we closed businesses, we restricted travel, and that was just seen as un-American, as heavy-handed. And I think we're seeing the backlash now, with a decrease in immunization rates, not only against sort of COVID, but against even all routinely recommended vaccines and mandated vaccines for school children. There are still school mandates, and you're starting to see a pushback on those school mandates, which is dangerous.
Okay. I wanted to go there later, but you did a perfect segue, so we're going to go there now, which is we have this pandemic. We're building the plane in mid-flight, as you said, and there's a lot of missteps along the way, but a lot of the fallout right now that we're seeing is, I believe, in 2019, 2020, 2021, a lot of it was unequivocal. Like you said, okay, it's 95% efficacy rate and it can't harm you and all these things. And then, due to testimony in front of the Senate or information leaking out or things happening, there's been a sort of backlash that's growing about, anti-vaxxing. And that could lead to, let's say something comes along that's Ebola or a more efficient novel COVID virus. And people are going to say, no, I'm not getting vaccinated because you lied to me the last time.
First of all, I think there's a general lack of trust, independent of a lack of trust for public health agencies like CDC, FDA, National Institutes of Health. I think there's just a general lack of trust that we're very quick to see conspiracy. We're very quick to see sort of dark, evil forces working behind the scenes that mean to do us harm. I feel sorry for Dr. Fauci, Tony Fauci, who was in many ways the face of the advice given by the CDC and the FDA. And he was just hammered. I mean, he still has, round the clock security because he's just always a target and because he was seen as lying.
There have been credible death threats, and credible death threats mean someone who clearly was on their way to kill me.
I think, although obviously we didn't always get it right, I don't think there was anything nefarious here. I think people were trying to get it right. They just didn't get it right at times. And I do think that looking back, we oversold this vaccine because we were so desperate to have people get it that we didn't make it clear that they weren't going to be protected against mild or moderate disease for long. We didn't make it clear that masks were at 100% effective. We didn't make it clear that transmission could be lessened but not eliminated. And so people saw us as overpromising and they didn't trust us. And I'm not sure what we can do to get that trust back. I think it's just because it's such a pervasive phenomenon right now.
I mean, one of the things was in June of 2022, there was a bivalent vaccine. Did I pronounce that right?
Bivalent, yes.
Yeah, bivalent vaccine that I believe you were a no vote on the committee for. That was sort of promised a lot and delivered nothing. What happened there?
Right. So the virus comes into this country in 2020. We have a vaccine by the end of 2020. Now, the vaccine that we used was directed against the original strain.
Right.
So the vaccines were all designed to prevent that strain, even though the strain started to change. We had variants. So, for example, in 2020, there was the Alpha variant and the Delta variant, which sort of lasted us through 2020 and then 2021. By the end of 2021, there was a new variant that came into this country called the Omicron variant, which was a dramatically different virus than the ones that had preceded it. It had 30 mutations in the part of the virus that attaches to cells. So that was a dramatically different virus. So it didn't matter whether you'd been naturally infected or vaccinated or both. You were not going to be protected against mild or moderate disease from this virus. You were still protected against severe disease, but you weren't protected against mild to moderate disease. So the thinking was, why are we still using the Wuhan strain? Why don't we use a strain directed against the Omicron variant? So the thinking at the time was, okay, we're going to test the water with 1 foot. We're going to have a half a dose of Wuhan and a half a dose of one of the Omicron strains, which ended up being BA4, BA5. BA4/BA5. So if you looked at the immunological data that were presented to our committee in June of 2022, they were not impressive. It didn't look like it was going to be any better. And so I was one of 2 no votes. I didn't see why we were going to be using something that didn't appear to be any better than what we had. And nonetheless, we kept selling it that way. And then immunological studies came out, which were reported in the New England Journal of Medicine, immunological studies done at Columbia, done at Harvard, that showed it was no better. Clinical studies done in US, in France, in UK showed it was no better. No worse, but no better. And we kept saying it was better. And I don't think anybody knew that. I really don't think doctors today know that it was really no better. But the scientists knew. And so when you talk about losing public trust, I think that we have lost the public's trust for other reasons, but we started to lose trust of scientists for this one because the scientists saw this. And I certainly got calls from scientists saying, what are you doing? This is not any better than what we had. And so it was hard watching people who were representing the public health, like Dr. Fauci, Dr. Walensky from the CDC, Dr. Ashish Jha, who was representing, the White House. He was the COVID response coordinator, saying it was better when at that point it really wasn't. And I'm not sure even if we'd said that, if we'd said, look, this is no better, we thought it was going to be better, we were wrong. We're not going to use a bivalent vaccine anymore. And we haven't used a bivalent vaccine since. I'm not sure that would have changed the public trust. I mean, we talk about how transparency will help engender public trust, but I think if we were transparent there, people would have just said, these people don't know what they're doing.
Right. So that was damaging to the scientific community, but you mentioned the public trust. What do you think were the steps or the missteps that hurt the public trust?
I think probably the biggest one was in August of 2021. Now, I'd like to say, by the way, I think that the messenger RNA vaccines made by Pfizer and Moderna were the greatest scientific and medical accomplishment in my lifetime. I mean, this was an unusual virus. We met it with a technology, messenger RNA, that we'd never used before. It was a remarkable, remarkable achievement. And I think immediately inoculating 70% of the US population by July of 2021 was a remarkable achievement. Mm-hmm. But I think what we took a step back in August of 2021. And that's when President Biden stood up in front of the country and declared that as of September, so 1 month hence, we were going to have a third dose for everybody over 12.
In the coronavirus pandemic, President Joe Biden got his third dose of the Pfizer vaccine today, something up to 60 million Americans are now eligible for.
Where did that come from? First of all, that's not the way it works. You have to go through the FDA. The FDA has to approve the use of that vaccine as a third dose, and then it has to go to the CDC to get a recommendation, right? FDA is a regulatory body, CDC is a recommending body. And it just skipped the step. He just stood up and declared that. So we, the FDA Advisory Committee, did meet in September, days before it was supposed to launch, and we voted no. And then a couple months later, the CDC met to discuss this third dose and voted no, because the data was consistent at this point, pre-Omicron, that it was still working well as a 2-dose vaccine. And the public was confused. They didn't know what it meant to be protected. I think they still don't know what it means to be protected. I think we just never made it clear, right, even to this day, of what the goal of this vaccine is, which is to keep you out of the hospital and to keep you alive. That's the goal. And I still think people are confused by it.
I want to go back to that, to keep you out of the hospital rather than quote unquote cure you or immunize you. But you mentioned Biden. You did this through 2 presidents. What did Biden get right? What did he get wrong? And what did Trump get right? And what did he get wrong?
All right, so I'll start with Trump. What Trump got wrong was so this was 2020. Mm-hmm. We didn't have antivirals till October of 2020, didn't have monoclonals till November of 2020, didn't have vaccines till December of 2020. We had nothing. All we had was shutter schools, close businesses, restrict travel, and try and avoid human-to-human contact. It was a nightmare. Anybody who lived through 2020 remembers it was a nightmare. Yeah. He wanted something magical. So he was musing about things like, UV ultraviolet light or ingesting bleach. I mean, those sort of dangerous, kind of crazy ideas. But the one he settled on that had an impact was he thought hydroxychloroquine, an anti-malarial drug, could be a lifesaver, because there was a doctor named Stella Emanuel who said, this is great, it works. She worked with a group that was this sort of right-wing physician group that said, we don't need vaccines, this is going to be great. So he basically twisted the arm of the FDA to authorize something that had never been shown to work or was safe for this problem, which was COVID. And so the FDA basically authorized something that had never been shown to work for COVID. And that's not the job of the FDA. The job of the FDA is to stand between the public and pharmaceutical companies to make sure that we get products that are safe and effective. Mm-hmm. And then 3 months later, 3 large prospective placebo-controlled studies were done to show that this didn't do anything to prevent or treat COVID. And so then the FDA withdrew it. That didn't look very good. I mean, it looked like the FDA could have its arm twisted by the federal government, which is not good. Right. So now you're a few months away from a vaccine, and there were 10 states that formed their own vaccine advisory committees because they didn't trust us. Now, I'd like to say, by the way, being on the FDA advisory committee, you are separate from the government. You are separate from pharmaceutical companies. You have to be. You fill out forms like every 3 months showing how you've not received a penny from anybody that works in the government or pharmaceutical companies. So you are independent, but I don't think the public perceived us that way. I think that what Trump got right was Operation Warp Speed. So this was a $11 billion program that basically bet on 6 horses, 6 vaccines to win 1 race. And that dramatically decreased the timeline. We went from so-called phase 1 to 2 to 3 trials in months, and the government paid for all that, and they paid to build the building, and they paid to mass produce the vaccine. They took the risk out of it for pharmaceutical companies. That made it much faster. So in 11 months, you had 2 large prospective placebo-controlled studies showing this vaccine worked and was safe. That's unprecedented. That's never happened before. And so that was good. I think what the Biden administration got right was mass distribution. They mass produced, mass distributed, mass administered that vaccine so that you inoculated 70% of the population within 6 months. But I think what Biden administration got wrong was, I think the vaccine story was a good story, the Biden administration. And I think by standing up and saying, look, we're going to pay for a 3rd dose in September of 2021, that felt good. It just wasn't scientifically based. And then the bivalent story was also not, was something that I think upset scientists, because we saw that it wasn't any better than what we already had.
So we're talking a lot about, I guess, communication, which is a problem. I think we both agree transparency, even if it's ugly, is necessary. But how do you effectively communicate imperfect knowledge? Like, some things were divulged, some things weren't. How do we get better at doing that and regain the public trust?
I think what we should have done, and it's always easy in retrospect, is when we had a vaccine in December of 2020, obviously we wanted people to get it. And when we sat on that committee and looked at data from essentially 35,000 people in December that had received 2 doses of the mRNA vaccines, we felt we knew enough to move forward and recommend authorization. But we didn't know everything. Because that wasn't the bar. The bar was, did you know enough? And I think we need to make that very clear to the public, that we're recommending a vaccine that's been given to 35,000 people, knowing that tens and hundreds of millions of people are about to get it, and that it is likely that the other shoe will drop, because that's always true. There has not been a medical innovation in history where there has not been a problem that resulted in something fatal often. I mean, so there's always a human price to pay for knowledge. It's always painful. And take your pick: antibiotics, gene therapy, anesthesia, chemotherapy. There's always a human price to pay for knowledge. You learn as you go. And I think it would have been nice at the beginning to say, look, we're recommending this vaccine. All the evidence is that it's safe and effective, but we have systems in place like the vaccine safety data link. Once this vaccine rolls out and we look at tens of thousands and then hundreds of thousands, then millions of people, we may find that there's a problem, but we'll know about it immediately, and we'll find out how rare it is and how severe it is, because that's what happened in 2 ways. One, with the messenger RNA vaccines, it was the myocarditis, inflammation of the heart muscle. Now, as it turns out, it was primarily a problem of the 16 to 29-year-old male, usually within 4 days of dose 2. And that was a surprise. No one anticipated that. But it was generally short-lived and self-resolving. So that was good. And we found that out fairly quickly. But keep people informed. Immediately when that happens, let them know we're looking and this might happen, and then it happened. But the worst story, obviously, was the vaccine that was authorized in February of 2021, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which had the advantage of being a single dose. But again, we had never had this kind of vaccine before in this country, the so-called adenovirus vectored vaccine. And what happened was we found that it was a rare cause of clotting, including fatal clotting in the brain, which ultimately drove that vaccine off the market by May of 2023.
Is that the AstraZeneca vaccine?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca, both had the adenovirus vector vaccine.
Do you believe that mandates were the right approach, A? And B, do you think that we overestimated the death count of COVID died from numbers?
I think we did overestimate it. I think that we didn't. There were some, I think, a number of hospitals where it was unclear whether or not people died with COVID or from COVID, because many of the people who came into the hospital were especially were older, meaning over 75, and had high-risk medical conditions like heart disease, lung disease, kidney disease, neurological disease, and they happened also to be infected with COVID, but that wasn't necessarily the reason they died. And I don't think that was clear. And there were some studies, epidemiological studies, that showed that we did, frankly, overrate the number of deaths. So that was true. I don't think it was malicious, but I think it was true that did happen.
Right.
Yes.
And do you think that it should have been mandated?
I certainly understand how we did it at the time. I'm working in a hospital where we were using things like bandanas for masks and garbage bags for gowns and trying begging other hospitals to get ventilators. It was really hard to watch people coming to the hospital who chose not to get vaccinated, and then were asking us to take care of them when we were having trouble taking care of the people we were being asked to take care of, whether COVID or not. And so I certainly understand it at the time. I think looking back at it, I'm not sure it dramatically increased immunization rates, and I think maybe it did more harm than good in the sense that people saw it as government overreach, and that therefore they came not to trust us in part because of the mandates. But I think they may not have trusted us anyway, just because you never know everything. You're always trying to push you go, and that fact is hard for people. People want to believe you know everything because you're injecting them with a biological agent and they're healthy. It's different when you're sick and you're giving people medicines because they see the risk benefit ratio is different. But when people are well, especially healthy young children, they perceive that product differently.
So we talked about a little bit about hindsight, and how are you supposed to study a vaccine during COVID when the government mandated a vaccine that we didn't know everything about? How do we do that, And what do you think the right way of doing this going forward?
I think we did this the right way in the sense that we did subject both of these early mRNA vaccines to a prospective placebo-controlled trial of 40,000 or 30,000 people for Pfizer and Moderna, respectively. That's the size of any typical vaccine. I do think going back, we should have made it clear what a vaccine can and can't do, and that we're going to learn as we go. This also virus continued to evolve. I mean, you went from the original variant, the so-called D614G variant, which was actually the virus that left China. It wasn't the Wuhan variant. And then you went to the Alpha, then Delta, then Omicron, and now and we go from each of these variants every year, right? So it's dizzying. But the one thing that's true, and I think this also is not something we've made clear to people. All we talk about is antibodies, right? And when we talk about giving people vaccines, we want to get their antibody level up so they can be protected, even really against mild to moderate disease for about 4 to 6 months. But we're generally protected against severe disease. Remember that, first of all, one, this virus is continuing to evolve, right? To go through all those iterations that I just said. Two, fewer than 20% of people are getting vaccinated. So most people aren't getting that yearly vaccine, and the virus is continuing to evolve. So if that's true, why is it that the number of hospitalizations and the number of deaths is down to like it's the all-time low for this particular virus?
Why?
And the answer is something we never talk about, and the answer is T cells. B cells make antibodies. T cells, in part, kill virus-infected cells. So the way antibodies work is they prevent the virus from binding to cells. The way the T cell works is the virus binds the cell, enters the cell, is then broken down by the cell. A part of the virus is quickly put on the cell surface. The cell's saying, kill me. I've been infected by this virus. I don't want it to reproduce in me. Kill me. And so that's what happens. The cell gets killed by these cytotoxic T cells. Now, the thing about T cells is, unlike antibodies, they are recognizing conserved regions on the virus. And that's why it is that, for the most part, because memory T cells are long-lived, we're protected against severe disease. I mean, I think if you've had 3 doses of vaccine or 2 doses of vaccine and a natural infection, and you're a healthy young person, and I'll define young as less than 65, you're probably protected against severe disease for a long time.
As you're talking about T cells, and I'm seeing that you're at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, I did a documentary on T cells in the University of Philadelphia with Dr. Carl June and the reprogramming of T cells to eat blood cancers.
I know Carl. I'm not affiliated with his lab, but he does the CAR T cell therapy, which is a remarkable story.
Here at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, doctors are using HIV to treat leukemia.
She was diagnosed just after her 5th birthday. They kept saying that she seemed a little more sick than most kids are and nauseous all the time.
A remarkable story where reprogramming T cells to eat cancer. And
you may be interested in this. The person who was kind of the first breakthrough case was a girl named Emily Whitehead.
Yes, I did the documentary. We interviewed her and her family, yeah.
April 17th, 18th, and 19th is when they put the cells in. May 10th is when I got the call from Dr. Grupp. Can't find a cancer cell.
They gave it to her, and 4 weeks later, she was in remission.
No, she's actually a medical student now at Penn.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah, and what's interesting about that story is there was years preceding that a man named Jesse Gelsinger, the 19-year-old man who had an enzyme deficiency, a liver enzyme deficiency, and he was really the first person who was treated with this sort of gene therapy. And 4 days after getting this gene therapy, which was actually an adenovirus vector, he had a sort of a sepsis-like response and died. And then they finally figured out what it was that had happened, which is he had this massive secretion of a particular kind of immunological protein called interleukin-6.
Mm-hmm.
So, and also there wasn't a treatment against interleukin-6 at the time. But when Emily had her response, and she had the same response a few days later, now you had interleukin-6. And so they gave her the interleukin-6 and saved her life. And if you go to Carl June's lab, you see pictures of Emily everywhere, right?
Yeah.
Emily meeting Obama, Emily on Dateline NBC. What you don't see is you don't see pictures of Jesse Gelsinger, which is my point. I mean, there's always a human price to pay for knowledge. Jesse Gelsinger paid that price, but you don't see his picture anywhere because we're much more comfortable celebrating the successes and not the failures that inevitably lead to those successes.
Speaking of some of the failures, we talked to a woman named Brianne Dretzen, who is experiencing a horrible vaccine injury. This was AstraZeneca. She was one of the people who had a neurological sort of reaction.
That's when they informed me that, yes, AstraZeneca had been put on hold previously due to severe neurological complications. And so we ended up in the ER 4 times over the next 2.5 weeks, ended up in the hospital after that.
And they're actually suing AstraZeneca and I believe the government, but it's difficult because of the PrEP Act. What do you think about that?
Well, certainly there was put in place, and I'm not sure how well it works, there's something in the United States called the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. So for people who have injuries following vaccination, and there certainly are. I mean, the oral polio vaccine could rarely but truly cause polio. There was a vaccine that was used in Europe called Pandemrix, a flu vaccine that could cause narcolepsy, permanent wakefulness. So there are real side effects, and sometimes severe and certainly fatal side effects of vaccines. I think there's a lot of claimed vaccine injuries that aren't necessarily vaccine injuries. But in terms of the adenovirus vector vaccine, it could clearly cause clotting because it surprisingly activated something called platelet factor 4, which no one anticipated, including fatal clotting of the brain. But and if that's what she had, then certainly she should be compensated. And there was, in theory, a sort of an emergency compensation program that was put in place with this vaccine. I just am not sure how well it works because it really shouldn't keep going to civil court. It's just an inefficient way to compensate people.
So speaking of, okay, we had AstraZeneca, we had Moderna, the mRNA uptake vaccines. We look at medical concerns, and like you said, there's human, collateral damage, if you will, with any medical technology. It seems like, for the size and scope of this vaccine, that the collateral damage was, I don't want to say acceptable or minimal, but it was within the realm of acceptability, let's say. However, it seems to have become highly, highly politicized to the point where people either believe it was the height of human technology and very, effective, and other people believe that this was, the worst thing the government's ever done to the American people, and they're not going to believe it going forward. Why do you think it's become so politicized? And how do we sort of get back to some sort of normalcy or centrist, non-political, scientific, sanity?
I don't know what gets us back to that. I mean, I certainly think that science is losing its place as a source of truth. I think science and scientists are seen as just sort of another voice in the room, that people declare their own truths. I mean, it is remarkable to me the level of denialism that occurred during this pandemic. I mean, that 30% of the US population by July of 2021, when we had a vaccine for 7 months, refused to get it because they thought the pandemic wasn't that bad, even though thousands of people were dying a day. And they weren't sure whether the vaccine worked, even though studies had shown that it worked extremely well and continues to work extremely well against severe disease. You really have to deny that. And I just think that's who we are at some level. Here you have, I don't know if you saw this recent documentary called The Truth versus Alex Jones, but 25% of this country, 75 million people, still believe that Sandy Hook massacre was a hoax. I mean, dozens of children were killed. These parents buried their children, and still they believe that these parents were actors and it never happened. I mean, what do you do with that? It just shows you that it's very easy to appeal to the notion that there are dark and evil forces working behind the scenes to do you harm, whether it's Sandy Hook or whether it's Tony Fauci and people at the CDC or the FDA. Although certainly not all conspiracies are wrong, I just think most of them are.
COVID became highly politicized, and there were so many facts being thrown around. You know, people go out and they say a lot of stuff, and you're like, well, I don't know what the hell is going on. What are your thoughts? I know you declined to debate with Bobby Kennedy, but what are your thoughts on him?
Yeah, so he actually called me. God, it's got to be more than 20 years ago.
Wow.
Because he said that he had parents come into his office, and these parents were concerned about the quantity of ethyl mercury, this thimerosal-containing preservative in vaccines, and that it was doing harm.
Like for autism? Was that for autism?
Yeah, that's autism or any kind of mercury-related side effects, whether it was neurological or developmental delays. So I had like a long talk with him. It was like for an hour or so. And I remember going home that night and saying to my wife, I had a great talk with RFK Jr. today. I think I really helped him to understand, because at that point that he called me, this was I think it was 2005. So there were already a handful of studies looking at children who had received thimerosal containing vaccines, compared them to children who had received the same vaccines that didn't contain thimerosal. And no difference, not surprisingly, because the mercury is in the environment. I mean, you're exposed to far more mercury, assuming you live on this planet and drink anything made from water, including breast milk or infant formula. And that's methyl mercury, which has a much longer half-life. So it never made sense it was going to be a problem, and it wasn't a problem. But I thought I really helped explain this to him. And then he published an article in Deadly Immunity that said, I was just in the pocket of the pharmaceutical industry because I, worked on a rotavirus vaccine, even though it wasn't a vaccine yet. And he lied. I mean, he just sandbagged me. And so I lost all respect. And then he would continues to put out the notion that the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine causes autism, when in fact, there's 18 studies, showing that you're at no greater risk of autism if you got that vaccine than if you didn't. So therefore, he to me is immune to facts. I think what surprises me that what you said is that you find him convincing. See, the people that worry me are not the Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s or the Marjorie Taylor Greenes of the world who constantly are anti-vaccine. It's the scientists who are credentialed and accomplished that get out there and say things that are not true. People like Robert Malone, who was a brilliant researcher, did some important early work on mRNA vaccines, or mRNA that ultimately became mRNA vaccines, that testifies in Congress that they cause cancer or autoimmune disease or a variety of chronic diseases.
The reason why I say Bobby Kennedy is convincing is because he's like, and I always use this example, but Tony Blair in his heyday during question period in the UK would just sort of jump up and hammer people with facts, and he'd be like, "No, the honorable member knows that in 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue, for Christ's sake." And you're like, "Yeah, okay, I believe you." And so when Bobby Kennedy gets out there and he'll be saying Captain Crunch has clovenflavanol 17, and this is a carcinogen, and he has these stats at his fingertips. Now, they're probably the stats of the doctors that you mentioned, but let's go back to that. Why are these doctors coming out and saying the COVID vaccine causes rare cancers or heart disease or heart attacks or all this stuff? Because, obviously the anti-vaccine community seizes on that and says, well, look at these, eminent scientists who are saying that it causes cancer and we're being duped.
I don't know why they do it. I don't. Maybe they like the light. Suddenly they're the light is shining on them. I mean, you look at the Surgeon General in Florida. Most states don't have a Surgeon General because we have a U.S. Surgeon General, but Joseph Ladapo, who's an MD, PhD from Harvard, who has written a missive to every healthcare worker in Florida saying don't give mRNA vaccines because they're contaminated with small fragments of DNA. First of all, anything made from cells has fragments of DNA, whether it's measles vaccine, mumps vaccine, rubella vaccine, chickenpox vaccine, rotavirus vaccine, of course there's fragments of DNA. And remember, assuming you live on this planet and eat anything made from vegetables or animals, you're ingesting foreign DNA, some of which will end up in your circulation. So I actually had to go on CNN to sort of address this and explain why it is that that of course there's fragments of DNA in a lot of these products, but one, even if they got into your cell in the cytoplasm outside the nucleus, they would be instantly destroyed because we can recognize foreign DNA. And then it can't get into the nucleus because it doesn't have a nuclear access signal. And even if it got into the nucleus where your DNA is, it can't insert itself into your DNA because it doesn't have the nucleus doesn't have enzymes to it. So you try and go through the science of this, and you think, I'm sure that doesn't Dr. Ladapo know that? Doesn't Robert Malone know that? And so why do they think? So I don't know. That's like a question for a psychiatrist. Why are they doing that when it's clear that it's not? Maybe they just like being a contrarian.
And shouldn't we have a sort of, maybe this is pie in the sky dreaming, but for the environment, for example, you have stats and people call the stats into question, and you're like, well, shouldn't we have a central, I don't know, information repository that's bipartisan and peer reviewed, or I don't know, something that so we can believe the FDA and the CDC? Like, how do we get around this? Because this is going to lead to bigger and bigger problems, and I don't know what the solution is. And you do this all day long. What are your solutions for this? This is a massive problem.
Okay, so here's what I would say. So Andrew Wakefield was a well-respected scientist, clinician, who published a paper in 1998 in The Lancet claiming that the MMR vaccine, measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, caused autism.
Yeah.
It got an enormous amount of play. It should never have been published. It wasn't a study. It was just a case series of 8 children who got an MMR vaccine who within a month developed signs and symptoms of autism. Well, you might as well have had 8 people who'd eaten a peanut butter sandwich who developed signs.
But it had a big knock-on effect.
Huge.
Yeah.
Huge. Thousands of people chose in the United Kingdom, and then here, tens of thousands of people not to get that vaccine.
Yeah, massive.
Hundreds of people were hospitalized, and 4 people in England died of MMR, of measles, because they were frightened by that vaccine. So what did the public health community do? What did the academic community do? In 7 countries on 3 continents, there were 18 studies done. That retrospective, obviously, you can't not give a vaccine purposefully to somebody. You can't do it prospectively, but you can do it retrospectively, right. And you just have to do the right controls. Control for healthcare seeking behavior, control for socioeconomic background, control for medical background. So you can isolate the effect of that variable, receipt of the MMR vaccine. Every one of those studies said the same thing. You were not at greater risk of getting autism if you got that vaccine or if you didn't. Still, that notion persists. And still, people like RFK Jr. say autism is caused by MMR vaccine. And even worse, what he did, which is why I really have so little respect for this man. This worries me. He worries me because I think we're in worse shape. I think because we don't trust the government. We're not going to be so quick to mask. We're not going to be so quick to have mandates, because I think there's been hundreds of pieces of legislation in each of the last few years pushing back against those mandates successfully. So I think we'll be less prepared next time.
So what should we do? I'm going to leave on one positive note. What should we do?
Okay, here's what I would say. As Tip O'Neill said, all politics is local. I think that's also true with all sort of public health information. And the point of light that I looked at this pandemic was a woman in Philadelphia named Ayla Stanford. So this is an African-American surgeon who worked at Temple, who took it upon herself to form something called the Black Doctors COVID Consortium with her own money. She then took many of her colleagues and went into North Philadelphia, a primarily Black and brown community, and sat in people's living rooms and explained to them why it was important they needed to get a vaccine. And if they said no, she came back, and then she came back again. And she gave them something they didn't have, which is somebody who looked like them, who listened to their questions and answered their questions. And in a period of not a very long period of time, she immunized 50,000 people in North Philadelphia. She was a point of light, and there need to be 10,000 Ayla Stanfords. And I think that's the way to go.
The American public deserve a lot better from their government. And what should have been a 9/11 moment for this country, this pandemic, was turned into a political nightmare. We need to do better.
Now we're going to close with Congressman Brad Wenstrup and his commission's final takeaways about the pandemic. Because of these mandates, because of what happened to businesses, because of what happened to schools, because of what happened to people's health, do you think science has lost its place as a source of truth, A? And B, how do we get it back?
Well, it has because of government interference, really. When you saw the government going out to social media and censoring people, when you had doctors that were prescribing some medications off label, which we've always done, and doing it safely. And they were being threatened that they would lose their license and things like that. Of course, the trust is gone. And trust has to be earned. And we have to get it back. But you can't silence scientific debate. And that's the thing that's the problem. None of this should have been Republican or Democrat. It's a scientific debate. That doesn't know any politics. Science doesn't know politics, shouldn't know politics.
You hit the nail on the head, and I'm gonna quote you here. You wrote, and I quote, "A future pandemic requires a whole of America response managed by those without personal benefit or bias. We can always do better, and for the sake of future generations of Americans, it can be done." Now, what I like about that is you've just seen this report, presided over the report, which is a litany of missteps, and you took it as a learning, and you said, we've got to learn from this. We've got to be honest with the American people. We've got to open it up and admit the wrongs so that we can do better in the future. Now, let's talk about that. How do we change it, and how do we do what you're saying here in your quote of for the sake of future generations of Americans?
Well, a lot of things that we have to do, they come from Congress or the government in general. Basically, a pandemic response in the future has to be an organized public-private partnership. Because you look at things like Operation Warp Speed, you have to be able to work with government to rapidly produce a solution.
Yeah.
And we have learned from this. And if the next one is viral in nature, how do we rapidly produce the monoclonal antibodies and the things that we can do? But it has to be scientific as well. One of the problems is there was this push within the government to ignore natural immunity. If you die before you achieve immunity, that's a problem. That's why we need vaccines or therapeutics along the way. But it got out of hand. And again, you take the doctor out of it. I'll give you an example. I was going to go to Germany for a security conference. They said, you need to get a booster before you're allowed to go. I said, okay, well, look, I got 2 doses of Pfizer.
Yeah.
Months later, I couldn't smell garlic salt when I was cooking. And I said to my wife, I guess I had COVID. Remember last week I had a chill?
Right.
So I said, well, look, before I get that booster, why don't we take a look at my antibodies and T cells?
Right.
Part of your immune response, right? And here on the Hill, they said, well, we can't do T cells, but we'll do antibodies. A strong number was 40. My number was 821.
Wow.
Okay?
Yeah.
Nobody would sit with their doctor and say, you've got to get this booster.
You're exactly right in that I was traveling at this time too, and you had to get a booster, and you had to have your little card, and you had to go everywhere and show the card, and you couldn't go anywhere, and you could. Why?
This was all they thought to use, and in some ways I get this, but what was misleading about that is trying to say that just having that card that you've been vaccinated makes it impossible for you to get COVID. That's not true.
Right.
And therefore, you can still transmit it.
Yeah.
So it really didn't hold much value. But if you're concerned about the individual's health and you say, look, well, you're pretty well covered and you seem to survive it before, but we know there's variants, you can get variants, but you seem to be able to handle that.
Yeah.
I mean, the Omicron variant was a significant problem.
Right.
Because, it penetrated even those that were vaccinated, right, which we expected, and it was pretty tough on people, especially vulnerable people.
Yeah. Where I got upset personally was everyone was unequivocal in the beginning. Nope, this is the vaccine, it works, and there's no, health, knock-on effects, and this is great. And now, oh, well, we knew there were health effects. We knew that there was ramifications. We knew that there were heart issues. And you're like, hold on, that's not what we said in the beginning. So you feel duped that someone's telling you unequivocally this is this. It's one thing to be proven wrong at a later date. It's another thing to know at that time, like you were saying, when they were standing on the White House lawn and saying something when they knew it wasn't true. And that's when I get upset as a journalist. And by the way, that's why the American people get upset. And I'm answering my own question because you get upset and then you're going to believe, your set of facts that you've seen. And some people, they're like, well, the fact that it's coming out of a lab is BS because it's a political thing and they want it and they want to blame the Chinese, whatever. And then other people are saying, well, of course it came from a lab. There's no way it came from a wet market. And nobody's going to agree. No, it's just not going to happen.
Well, you think of things that could be done better. So, President Trump says we're going to limit travel. No, we're going to restrict travel. Politicians start saying during that election year, oh, Donald Trump is a racist and a xenophobe. So Dr. Fauci, who was the voice of the government, basically, the scientific voice of the government throughout this, we asked him in the transcribed interview, did you support President Trump on the idea of restricting travel? And he said, yes. We said, was it racist? He said, no. Was it xenophobic? He said, no. Well, why, Dr. Fauci, did you not step up and tell the American people, no, it's not. It's a decision that I supported.
Right.
He never did. And I will say another thing, because I've been asked this thing. Well, somebody said, did you really go after Republicans? I said, look, we had people from both sides of the aisle and both sides of the arguments there. And most of the people, I have no idea if they're Republican or Democrat. When you have people in from the agencies, they don't come with an R or D after their name.
So now that this report has been released a couple weeks ago, is there accountability? What does accountability look like for the Chinese, for Fauci, for the, these doctors who spread misinformation? There's got to be some sort of recompense. What's going to happen?
I mean, Joe Biden meets with President Xi, and as far as we know, he never brought up COVID at all. He didn't even say, how are your people doing these days?
How do you think Trump will respond?
I don't know. I mean, I think he more wants to move on, but he wants the truth to be out there, and he wants this report to be recognized.
Yeah.
And if you look at our 17 pages of recommendations, some things need Congress to take action. In some cases, it's for the agencies to take action. Look at the agencies in general. We have a problem. And, they may have a set of criteria that they say are their standards, but nothing happens when they violate them. That's a problem. There needs to be criminal liability enforced. And you look at the military, for example. In the military, unethical is unlawful, and you go to jail.
Last question is, where do we go from here? And do you believe we'll be well prepared for the next major global outbreak, which sadly we know is probably coming?
If we really start now shoring up our supply chain, this is a national security issue. This is a national health issue. Right now, when it comes to generic medications, we can't produce them without China. China has the active pharmaceutical ingredients market cornered, and the world knows it now. And if you'd have told me when I was in Iraq as a surgeon that my protective equipment and my pharmaceuticals relied on an adversary, China, how did our military let this happen? We've got to shore up our supply chain across the board for everything that you would need during a pandemic. And then you really want to have assignments of who does what, and not have it crossing over all the agencies, but also reporting to a central body that's trustable, that is agnostic. But we've got to start putting that together right now.
We need a sane, accountable government that doesn't lie to us. Thank you for your work, and thanks for your time today.
I appreciate it. I had a good team working with me. Let me put it that way. There were a lot of hardworking people on the staff.
Well, sadly, this topic isn't going to go anywhere, so if anything happens, we're going to hit you up again to keep the information getting out to the people. Thank you again.